our results. My presentation, my report, will be consisting of 3 parts. First will be methodological, about the model we use. It's not an input-output model, it's a production function model, but we like to play with it. The second part would be some implications from this model. The third part would be the most interesting on my account, because it will be about money, how money are generated. But if you would be too tired up to that point and would like to have a coffee break, please tell me to stop. So, the first one is I edited the last moment when Leonardo was making his report. It's a tribute, in fact. You had an assumption that the high elasticity for China probably depends on its R&D expenses. So here is a small chart we provided with my aspirant, doctoral student, and it is for China. It's the industries of Chinese economy. The red line is, you see, the share of exports in the output. The blue line is the share of R&D expenses in intermediate inputs, intermediate consumption. And the green line is the correlation. So we kind of sorted the industries on how they are correlated. The less correlated are here, the more correlated are at first, at the start. So you see the correlation goes very high, up to 2/3 of the industries. For the Russian economy, we have much less industries, about 10 of them, which are highly correlated, where the R&D expenses are highly correlated with the share of exports. But it could be a nice addition to what you do, just the last moment. Okay, now to what I would like to tell. We have a model. We built it on the raw input-output database data, socioeconomic tables. We took several factors. First, well, okay, of course, labor and capital and total effective productivity. We call it technology growth rate. For the labor, we build our scenarios over the demographic forecasts by the United Nations on the unemployment scenario, which is exogenous, economically active population, which is a very, very stable. In fact, in every country of the world, it's like 50 to 55% of total population. It's different in countries where the statistics is very bad, like India. But in all countries that report it, well, it's between 50 and 55. Then labor broke down to hours worked by one employed person into 3 kinds of labor, depending on quality. The capital, where it is possible, is divided into high-tech capital and non-high-tech capital, so 2 kinds of capital. And finally, the most important variables which we control is fixed capital, fixed assets life duration, and fixed assets per employed person. This is a very interesting parameter we play with. So it's like total fixed assets in the economy, total investments accumulated for one person employed, one worker. Or, as we call it, the cost of a working place. If you add another worker, you need to provide a working place for him, but it's not only a machine or a computer, it's also a part of a building, it's also a part of infrastructure you need to build. So it's kind of the total investments you need for that. Amortization. There's no of investments. It's endogenous, in fact. We make some some forecasts to 2045, and we account for about 90% of world GDP with these countries. Okay. That's how it shows. That's what we see, the total world, the countries we account for in our model, and some countries are here as just the GDP and constant prices. You see China here in red, which is taking more and more world economy. But when we compile the world GDP, we don't use purchasing power, but we use current rates to make it as a whole. That's why China is not exceeding the United States. What is interesting is China and India, quite fast growth, and a problem with European Union. You see this line, especially selected here separately to show that there is a problem. These are the most interesting variables. For example, this is for China. What we look at, what variables should stay stable or should be explainable. Fixed assets per employed is a scenario variable. We can put this part of scenario as we want. We make it constant, we make it rocket to the sky. Here, you see on the historical, in the history, it moved with a high tempo, high rate of growth, but it was more or less stable. So it could be an exponent. We make it slower, not an exponent, and we could make it even slower, like linear. It makes a huge difference in the forecasts. This scenario, as you can see, pushes down Chinese growth rates to 4 and then down to 3%. GDP in constant prices grows a bit slower, but other variables are more or less explainable. Labor productivity grows linearly, capital productivity grows at the same rate, the growth of employed persons slows down a bit, so we don't get as much of labor input. Investments are slowed down too. How much is China? I took China as an example to show you how our model works. We could do it with any other country. Okay, how is China elastic to the forecast of the fixed assets growth? Here are the fixed assets, the history, and here are 3 scenarios. The red one is exponential growth, a stable rate. China continues to build factories, continues to build infrastructure at the same rate. Is it possible? Well, hardly. We know that putting too much money into infrastructure puts a great burden on regional government debt and central debt, and new investments might not bring that much of output. So will it slow down? The blue line is kind of slower down rate of investment per person, and the green one is just linear for a long history. So we have 3 forecasts of GDP in these cases. The first one, if it grows exponentially, if it continues its investments into businesses and infrastructure, we can keep GDP rates between 6 and 7 for a long time. If it becomes, well, that's kind of a polynomial trend, the blue line. We go down to 3.5 to 4% growth. And if there are problems with investments, if they come to a linear line, we could come down to 2%. So Chinese growth is very elastic to its investment rate. If we make a forecast like in Professor Anton's presentation, that consumption rate would go up to 70% in GDP, it would mean real problems, here in the growth rate. From the point of view of our model, which of course is based on the history of how it was in 80s, 90s, 2000s. years. Okay. The last thing about this model I would like to show you is about coefficients. Okay, we have coefficients for capital. They are built on regressions, of course. Lower quality labor, middle quality labor, high quality labor, and total factor productivity over technological changes. R squared is very high everywhere. I mean, 0.95 is a bad number for us. But negative coefficients are common. High quality labor could be negatively influencing economic growth in some countries. For example, in the United States. Is it true? But middle quality labor has quite a high level of elasticity, almost 75%. Other countries are more sensitive to high quality labor. I don't know, Finland, if you find it here. It's here, yeah, Finland. Very 19, it's very, very. There's Indonesia. There are about half of the countries we have in this table just for it to be discernible on the screen. Capital could be negative. Yeah, I think the country is more, but with Malaysia, it's dependent on total factor productivity more than capital and labor. It's very, very interesting. Technological changes are more important than anything else. And of course, when you put too much labor and your GDP grows not as much fast, then this labor can have a negative coefficient. So this is also a result we now keep in mind when someone says that this or that parameter influences GDP negatively. We can think that it compensates for some other parameter, which is growing much higher and more closer to GDP. Yeah, all right. So now we move to the second part, to proportions to shares of creating value added in the world economy. When we talked about Chinese growth, it struck us that we need to understand which sectors would grow. Would we all move from producing manufactured goods to software, to services and the like? So we thought of looking at how services are produced in the world and what are the proportions. For example, if we look at Americans, I mean North America and South America, the common thing to say is that services are growing and taking some part of manufacturing process. Of course, on the one hand, you can divide manufacturing process, you can make it into several entities, which would provide them services for the main entity. Yeah? You outsource your accounting. Now it's not part of your production process, but a service you buy. You can outsource, I don't know, oil rigging. Yeah? Oil rigs. Now they are services and not belong to oil producers. Does this process have any ceiling? When you outsource too much, you lose control. You need to control your production. So, what can we forecast for the future for the United States? Will the service sector take 70, 80, 90%, as in Hong Kong, for example? So this is not a very mainstream division, because as you can see, we have put transport separately from the services. It is always 10% in any economy, in any part of the world. It's 10% of GDP, so we put transport to it. We put agriculture, construction, and mining into primary sector. Well, we do the division. That's what we wanted to do. So we just look at the manufacturing end service. So, what to think of this part? Will it go straight to zero to manufacture, or to 2 or 3% as agriculture, or would it stay the same? Our thought would be that when you increase the number of services in your economy, that means that you move your manufacturing process somewhere else. So this is not one timeline. These two charts show the same timeline from 1970 to 2018. And this jump in Asia is because China started to provide separate figures for mining within industries, mining and manufacturing. Before 2003, it was the same. So this is a purely statistical jump. But if you just look from this year, from 2003, the figures are quite stable in Asia. In the Americas, they turn around about 2015. This is not discernible here, but it collides with making America great again or reindustrialization. And if we finally make the whole world together, we can see that from 2004 or around that, there are no significant changes in this division. It's not like you are creating more services in the world economy. You just move your production to other countries and make more services in your own country, or vice versa. This is what struck us. So, you see, Europe is plus Africa is quite stable from 2008, around that. Every big region in the world has now hit some ceiling in moving from manufacturing to services. So, if you make a forecast for China, for example, that it will provide more services within its GDP and less manufacturing, and that will keep its GDP growth at the previous levels, then you must have a reliable explanation. Where would you move the manufacturing process? To Africa, to Latin America, to, I don't know, Indonesia. But there should be an explanation. Your scenario cannot just say we will provide for more services, which ask for less capital, which demand less capital and more labor, something like that. You have to provide some real explanation for it. So that was the first implication from the model we built. And now it gives us some constraints. Here are the outcomes. As we see it, if we aggregate sectors, then we have some constraints, some ceilings. Tertiary industry services not been growing due to secondary sector until recently. Now only the primary sector of mining and agriculture contracts a bit slower and provides for services. And finally, what I already explained, someone has to wash the dishes. Okay, and now we're moving to the third part. If you have too tight, you have still time. Okay. We, at our institute, at our department of finance, microfinance, are not very content with the classical equation. PQ equals to MB. It's Fisher's equation, but when we try to apply it, then we discover that P is not about prices, Q is not about volume, V is not about velocity, monetary turnover, and if Shakir Ibragimov stops playing the technical guy and finishes finally his research on on the velocity of monetary turnover, he will explain everything about it, I hope. So finally, what is M? Monetary mass? No, it doesn't come down to that. In this equation, and when we try to apply it, we miss two very important things, time and motivation. Time is the time the economy needs to adjust for any changes. When you have financial changes, nothing happens immediately. This is an example. We took all the crises of percent rate, discount rate. The crisis of discount rate is when you put your discount rate rather high compared to previously stable dynamics, and then you lower it for some years, like our central bank did in 2015. So we took more than 50 of these crises in different countries in different years, and we compared them to the investments. This is the norm of investment, the share of investment in GDP. So, when you have very high discount rate, of course, your domestic credit stops for a bit or slows down. You make less investment. So, your share of investment goes down, goes down. And when you start to lower your discount rate, it doesn't react immediately. It starts to react on the 4th year. So every economy has 3 or 4 years to adjust for that. When you make an input-output table, how do you call it? Iteration. Yeah. One iteration is usually a year. But when you put in some exogenous impetuses from financial side, it could be 3 or 4 years. That's the first thing that we didn't like about the classical equation. Another thing is about motivation, how to create money. The money are generated from the demand for domestic credit. When you ask for more money, when you ask for more credits, then you create money in your economy. They are not created by the governments. That's the first point. Next point. When you have different kind of economies, one is more complex, another is less, and there is an index already made by MIT team, as I remember, index of economic complexity. Maybe it's not the best one because it shows it is based on the share of exports in the output and on the share of your production, the world production of any good. So the more goods that your country is important for, then the more complex your economy is. If your country is present in the world market for the certain good, then you are accounted for this market. Okay, the more markets you cover, the more complex your economy is. It's a basic idea, and you could also make some mathematical measures on input-output tables on how condensed they are. Is your production condensed in few sectors? Is it more or less smooth over all sectors? And when you compare the exports column and the total internal production, then you could make a similar measure by applying some math to your input-output table. Anyway. Sorry? Okay. Anyway, there should be some connection between this economic complexity, here are very complex economies, here are very simple economies, and the amount of money they need to function. The blue line is credit to private sector plus central debt, the debt of the government. And what is interesting in the countries that are very high in this regard, we need very much money comparing to others. I have wrote them down here. Japan, USA, UK, Canada, Spain. So the blue line shows how much money is generated inside the country. Here is a very similar chart. We have the same economic complexity index, the same ranking, but the blue line shows how much money, how much debt is generated only by the private sector. So we don't take public debt here. Now we have Japan. You see, Japan is very high in public debt. It's not so high in private debt. The first one is USA. Okay, Denmark, Norway here, Canada very high in private sector, Thailand, China. China is here, Hong Kong and New Zealand, South Africa,
US,
Australia, Vietnam is very high, Cambodia. And this comparison leads us to the second part of what is lacking from the classical equations is motivation. How much confidence do you have in your economy? That confidence is measured, I'd say, by the private sector debt, not by the whole debt. For example, Spain, it lacks too much credit in the private sector, but it makes much of public debt because it was in the European Union and it could make it. Okay, we could find Greece somewhere here too. Albania. Okay, I'll skip this and move here. It's about the same chart on other axes. So we have complex economies here on the horizontal scale and very simple economies here on the left. We have economies which use much money high up, and we have economies which use less money for the same GDP down here. It's my favorite thing because for the same amount of GDP, these economies use very different amount of money. China, you see, is the highest one. So it provides much confidence in the economy, much confidence in the future growth because it keeps it stable. There is a certain part of public debt in that, certainly, but not all. Japan, yeah, for public debt. South Korea, Czech Republic is here. It doesn't need as much money, but it's rather complex. You see, it's not far from Germany. Russia and Belarus use very little money on simple economies here, which use very little money and were not producing a big variety of goods. And this chart would be the base for our future research, which will already start. We want to put a measure of confidence into measuring the money, not just measuring the monetary mass, but the source of a generation, who is providing this new debt, who is providing this new resource. The measure of violence. The violence is when you make people believe that this money are good for the public debt. And finally, how that corresponds with the variety and complexity of your economy, which could be measured by this index, from MIT, or, and it's the next step, I hope we'll make it, is they could be measured by some mathematical characteristics of input-output tables as a whole. Well, I would call it the beauty of the table. That's for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's now the time.
Yes, Anton, I think that was a very intriguing presentation and my mind was hopping with many questions and ideas. I'm just going to ask you a very specific question. When you talked about the TFP analysis, looking at different countries, and you talked about you had the negative coefficient on several factors, Can you tell more about the form of your analysis? Is it growth accounting, or is it production function, or what did you do exactly there, and how should we interpret the negative coefficient?
Thank you for the question. It is a production function in a usual form, like capital and labor and TFP. We take capital and labor in like physical stock form, not in additional form. So it's like this amount of capital, where we have it, this for one employed person, and this amount of employed persons with this amount of hours per person per year make you this GDP. So it's potentially GDP, more or less.
Use a CES production function?
Yes, general production function. So then, when some factors grow too well with GDP, other factors should compensate for them. It's pure mathematical. But then it leads you to think why. Why is this type of labor is more important than another one? Why some countries have very high sensitivity to high quality labor and others have zero or negative. Mostly because at the history period in which we trained our model, much of economy was developing in the manufacturing sector. That's why they used middle quality labor. So yes, it's highly sensitive to that. In case of Finland or Norway, they developed very high-tech technologies, high-tech industries. So high-quality labor is very important for them. It works like that. It helps you to understand how the different economies developed during that period, and will they continue or in the same regime or different?
Anton, one of the most interesting parts of your doesn't work. Well, I'll try to do it well. One of the, in my opinion, one of the most interesting parts of your research is your discussion of the correlation between the economy complexity and the monetization of GDP. So my question is, how do you, first of all, how do you measure complexity? Several words. And the second one, how do you explain this positive correlation?
Yeah. That's the most interesting part for me too. Thank you. So the complexity, we take the index which was designed by a special team, which is now in MIT, Massachusetts Technological Institute. What they measure is how many products are produced in your country, how many different products, which are important in the world market. I mean, if you produce some amount, but it's only in your economy, that doesn't count. If you produce some amount and you export it and you are obvious in world market, you are present there, then you are accounted. So you account 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. If you produce one product for the whole world and nothing else, you are not very complex. If you start producing airplanes, it's not like you are selling only airplanes. You are producing a whole range of technologies for that. Avionics, materials, so on and so on. So you create a whole nomenclature, wide range of products, which you also export. You become important in the world market for these products. So you become more complex. That's the way this index is accounted. I deliberately did not include formulas in my presentation. It would be huge then. But you can relate to the Massachusetts, where is it? ECI, Economic Complexity Index.
Where's the USA?
Somewhere here. USA has a big part of agriculture and primary industries. Primary industries always move you here because oil is oil. And when you have airplane, it's millions of positions. So, how is that connected with the monetary mass? My idea was that the money itself is a measure of economic freedom. I know it's kind of not mainstream, but I like non-mainstream ideas. So the money, as it is created, is a measure of economic freedom, is a measure of options you have to invest your resources. You create resources. You are thinking of how to invest them. If you have a state-planned economy, you don't have any options. You are told what to do. When you shift towards market economy, you have more and more options. When your economy becomes more complex, you have more options of how to invest. Therefore, only with more freedom, or market freedom, you need more money. The economy needs more money. It's some kind of a natural process. I cannot explain it better at this step, but I hope I'll build a new monetary theory which explains it. I'm not quite content with the existing ones. Even the modern monetary theory is called. So, when we take it as the level of economic freedom, then we can understand somehow that with more options, we need more savings or resources, or they just create other money. I'm not ready to give a clear answer at this stage, but the direction is.
Oh, thank you. I think we've had you long enough now there, but there's still a very big one from this side.
So I hope that I will be forgiven for my two questions, but can you open a description of the production function? Because I spent with one postgraduate student several years for estimation of some kind of functions. It's description of fact, yes. So many factors. Or you just have labor and fixed assets. But you have breakdown of labor. So did you have three kinds of labors in production function?
Yeah. For some countries, yes. There was a CLAMS project. There was a World Input-Output Database, which provided three kinds of labor, shares of labor, for some countries. For them, we used all those three.
But this is a power function. So you have to have
in logarithm
sum of coefficients of degrees equal 1. And have you logged this function?
Yes, of course.
What has been done with the function?
Yes, of course, it is logged, and we work with logarithms, and no, they do not account up to 1.
Okay.
Because then it breaks the model, really.
But it's not so easy to decide this problem. Okay, well, let's go ahead. And second question, can you open equation with money, GDP and so on in the end of?
Yeah.
Okay, so this equation, famous equation.
Fisher's equation.
Yeah. But many years ago, John Maynard Keynes described equilibrium of money market using interest rate. So my question is why you did not use this much more complicated equation where there is a description of many factors which impact on money supply and on money demand.
All right. In fact, we use that, exactly that, the Keynes equation, and we use the discount rate, percentage rate, as the main balancing factor in our other models. Here I explained why I'm not content with the classical equation. All right. When we use discount rate to balance monetary supply and monetary demand, it's exactly what leads us to these things. It also does not explain much, well, a big part of the story, a big part of our life. The answer is here. We cannot take usual monetary aggregates for monetary mass, even in Keynesian sense. We have to break it down to private debt and public debt. I didn't know this, yeah, but there are corporate debts, household debts, public debts. They all have different in different economies. Some economies rely more on public debt and redistribution, some more on corporate debt, others on, well, the United States here. Yeah. Public debt, then households, then corporation. And there are different stories in Korea. Very small public debt, then household, then corporations. So we have different money, in fact. That's what I wanted to underline and show, and that's what we're researching, how different money are created. And then, do we have to turn to different interest rates for different money or not? Or is it universal? There are a lot of questions arising from this approach.
Anton, thank you very much. But before I clap hands for you, can you just open one for me? One with, you know, all the countries below? No, below, yeah. That one, yeah. You know, what I like about this one, you will see South Africa is also on it, not always, but it's better than Australia. So I think we're going to win them with the rugby. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.